I have to give credit where credit is due, and religious people have some really smart stupid. Have you ever heard the answers in Genesis response to the biblical incest problem? Because if you haven't, you're in for a real treat. It goes like this. When God made Adam and Eve, he made them perfect so that they could fuck their kids could fuck each other, their kids could fuck each other, nothing would ever go wrong. But then they ate the fruit, as we know. God lost his shit, and he decided that each successive generation would be a little bit less perfect than the last one. Now, at first, this didn't matter much because the imperfections they passed on were relatively small. So sisters could still fuck brothers and cousins could still fuck cousins, and you wouldn't get any gills or flippers. But as time went on, each family carried an increasingly number of similar imperfections such that after enough generations, those imperfections in you and those imperfections in your brother are so similar, you'd make fish people. Of course, when God flooded the world, he simply reached into Noah's family's DNA and reset the mutant switch so that they could go through the whole process again. Pretty fucking clever, right? I mean, it's still stupid. You'd have to have families having 800 kids apiece to get back to 7 billion by now. And if this was true, we should be able to trace ancestral DNA back to some approximation of this perfection that he speaks of. And then on top of that, it relies on a bunch of biological principles that they just conjure out a whole cloth along the way. It's naive post hoc bullshit, but it's clever naive post hoc bullshit. If I was writing a novel where I had to explain away the post-Diluvian cousin fucking problem, I'd be patting myself on the back if I came up with that. It falls apart as soon as you give it some critical thought, but it makes sense if you're grasping for a rationalization. And of course, I bring that up to reinforce the point that we already know, but need to remind ourselves from time to time, religious people aren't stupid. Well, sorry. Most people are stupid, so most religious people are stupid by default, but they're not stupid compared to us. Well, sorry, I mean, they actually kind of are because on the average we have higher IQs and more education, but they're not all stupid. I mean, the actual difference in IQ is statistically significant, sure, but it's not overwhelming. There are plenty of religious people that are way smarter than the average atheist, and they've been thinking about this shit. And obviously, look, you know that, but sometimes it's really hard to keep that in mind. When you're presented with a person who actually thinks we cousin fucked our way into a population of 7 billion people in the 4,000 years since all the animals gathered together in a magical superboat, it's really easy to write that person off as a frothing fucking idiot. Really easy. I mean, really, really easy. What's hard is to stop and think to yourself, maybe this person is really smart and has logical but incorrect ways of rationalizing away this incredibly stupid thing. This is probably a lot easier for people who used to be religious, right? I mean, that losing your faith wasn't like taking the unlimited pill. You didn't start suddenly beating Robert Duvall at chess and learning Portuguese. You just realized you were wrong about something, and it probably happened right after you were introduced to new sources of information or new ways of evaluating the sources you already had. But for people like myself, people who called bullshit on this stuff when they were kids, it can be really easy to underestimate your opponent in a religious argument. But look, this shit has occurred to them before too, even the smart ones. So whether they wriggled out of it by randomly applying the parable excuse, or they cowered away from it by blaming the devil for testing them, or rationalized it away with some fictional reimagining of how DNA works, they got through it somehow. They didn't just forget about the question the next time they ran headlong into a wall. And I'm not just pointing this out to be amicable. Imagine that you're in a conversation with a creationist and you pull out the incest question, right? They give the AIG-approved answer, and this is the first time you've ever encountered it. Now, sure, give you a few minutes to mull it over. You can probably poke some fatal holes in it, but odds are you're not going to have them at the ready. And even if you do, the creationist is going to think you might be moving the goalpost if you say, well, that still doesn't account for the 7 billion people on the earth since then. You basically just conceded a point. That's how they're going to take it. And if anybody's listening in, that's how they're going to take it too. On top of that, it's probably going to be obvious that you're hearing this for the first time. So even if you can't explain why that's wrong, you're probably just going to be telegraphing the fact that you don't really even know the counter arguments here. You're reinforcing a stereotype that the creationists love to assert, the one that says the atheists are afraid to listen to their arguments because they're so damn convincing. Of course, that's not to say that you have to listen to Ken Ham's presentations. I wouldn't wish that on an ethnic cleanser, but if you want to involve yourself in the argument, you should take the time to know the standard answers they're going to give you. A Twitter drive-by that points out all the sister fucking in the Old Testament isn't going to be very convincing to a person who can immediately turn to Ken Ham for a ready hand-waving explanation that makes sense to them. That's not to say there's no value in that particular Twitter drive-by. I'm not telling anybody how to tweet, but if you think stuff like that is going to sway anybody, you're probably underestimating them. Anybody who ever got roped into a debate with a well-versed apologist will tell you the same thing. It's not enough to know the truth. You also have to know the lie. Hell, I heard Joe Rogan mop the floor with Phil Plait in a debate about whether the moon landing was a hoax. Phil Plate's a goddamn professional astronomer and a damn talented science communicator, and Joe Rogan knew so damn little about this stuff that he thought the moon landing was a hoax. But Phil Plate didn't familiarize himself enough with the pseudo-history that surrounded this shit to successfully counter any of it in a debate. Now, to his credit, he learned his lesson, corrected it, went back, and so successfully whipped Rogan's ass in the follow-up that Joe now admits that we definitely landed on the moon. But he only got there by learning the bullshit. And that's really hard to do. It's really hard to listen to a moon hoaxer drone on for an hour, or even worse, read one of their fucking books. But if you want to argue with a dedicated 9/11 truther, it's not going to be enough to know that jet fuel does in fact burn that hot. So I don't blame you if you want out. Nobody is under any particular obligation to argue with creationists or religious apologists or moon hoaxers or 9/11 truthers. But if you are going to do it, you're under an obligation to do it well.